As you may be aware, and if you're watching this video, then I assume you are, yesterday Paul Embery tweeted what was, from his perspective, an innocuous statistic. This was picked up by various lockdown skeptics and used to promote and bolster their worldview. Incidentally, it's a worldview that's at odds with the scientific and healthcare community. Now, this spawned an article today on UnHerd, and that's what I'll be looking at now. So, before we start, a confession. I find Paul Embery really interesting, and I think he's a very important voice, and I think he should be listened to, even though I'll also freely admit that I frequently disagree with him. I'd like to think that if we were in a pub or cafe, and Paul, Pequena Portugal welcomes you if you'd ever like to pop down, we'd have a decent time picking each other's ideas apart. That said, I think the article that he's written for UnHerd about his use of an NHS statistic makes the political point that he wants it to, but at the expense of carefully avoiding the substance of complaints against his tweet. Now, first up, please read the article to check I'm not misrepresenting him. But nonetheless, I think his arguments are that the Twitter mob was over the top in its reaction to his tweet, and he gives example in the article that I absolutely agree with. But at the same time, I think the majority of complaints he received were evidenced and were fair, and those views are omitted from the article. His second point is that he doesn't believe things that his accusers said he believed. Things that, like, he doesn't care about vulnerable and elderly people. And on this, I think his statement is 100% fair. He has frequently claimed that those that need help should get it, and he's also said that money should be no object to their care. That said, in terms of his position as a lockdown skeptic, he's never actually explained how this may work in practice. And there are numerous explanations of why this idea is pretty much a non-starter, and I'm not going to go into those here, but I will point you towards Neil O'Brien MP, and he's done a great job of explaining this, and there's a link in the section below. So first up, I suppose we should look at the tweet. It states, the number of COVID-related deaths in England involving individuals under the age of 60 and free from a pre-existing condition is 377. This is for the entire period of the pandemic. So, first, again, let's have a look at the Twitter mob comments. He got them. Anyone with a public profile does. They're definitely a problem, and those people, I think, need to actually have a look at themselves and ask what they were hoping to achieve by their behaviour. The issue they've managed to do here is they've created a smokescreen that Paul is hidden behind, and that in itself is not helpful for us getting to the truth. His article mentions that he was accused of misrepresenting the data, and superficially, it's true. He got many complaints using that word, but referring to his presentation rather than the statistic itself, which, as the tweet, missed key information and context that would allow us to fully understand what the 377 figure really means, I would say is accurate on balance. However, I don't want to get hung up on this, as he also received many more complaints of using misleading figures or misinformation. Now, these claims are less ambiguous than those using misrepresenting, as that's kind of open to opinion. And I believe his tweet meets the criteria for both misleading and misinformation. So I'll focus on that because, as I've said, it's not so much open to opinion, and I also believe it's a better fit to the common understanding of what was happening yesterday. Now, I find it interesting that Paul doesn't confront this in either his replies or the article. It could just be an oversight, but I think that in order to take the moral high ground, as the article intends, then this kind of level of completeness is really essential. Otherwise, it can look a bit like he's using a technicality to attack a straw man, and that's not a great look. Now, another of Paul's key points is that he simply presented the figures without comment. Now, that in itself is true, but it's also misleading. Statistics don't exist in vacuums. The simple act of choosing what to present is itself a comment of sorts. For example, had he tweeted yesterday that London ambulance service is taking 400 calls an hour, he would have been making a very different point, comment or not. Both the statements are superficially neutral and are also 100% accurate, but to the average reader, they're telling very different stories. One is saying, don't worry about COVID, it's unlikely to hurt you if you're young or healthy, while the other is clearly stating, the ambulance service, and by extension, the NHS in London, particularly accident and emergency, is absolutely overwhelmed by COVID. This is a serious risk to our health service. So just saying without comment in no defence. It's generally just an attempt to avoid taking responsibility, and something that Donald Trump does a lot when he says things like, a lot of people are saying, as a caveat to a baseless claim. All his supporters will hear is, I, Donald Trump, believe this to be true, and I am telling you that. But he can also hide behind, I was just saying what I heard. I never said that I thought that. when he's asked by someone less sympathetic to him. So it's not really a defense, it's more a rhetorical trick. In this part of the video, we'll move on to Paul's main defense of his tweet. And to do that, we need to understand the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So information presented that's accurate but looks to imply something that isn't, that's misinformation. For example, I tweeted the following to Paul. Now sadly he didn't respond, so I can't be sure that he saw it. Anyway, it goes as follows. Did you know Porton Down has stocks of Novichok, and it's far easier to get it to Salisbury from there than it is from Moscow? Makes you think. Now if I were to present these facts, and just to be clear, they are 100% fact, without comment, I am confident that most people would assume that I was saying that Porton Down and not Russia was the likely source of the Novichok poisoning in Salisbury. This is misinformation. It's information that is ostensibly accurate, but is being used to create an inaccurate impression of something that's happened or is happening. Now, if, however, I'd gone further and said that the UK government, using Novichok from Porton Down, likely attempted to kill the Skripals in Salisbury, I'd be engaging in disinformation. This is because there's just no evidence to suggest that whatsoever. So as you can see, there's a fine line between disinformation and misinformation, and it's something the best propaganda straddles really effectively, because it allows a defense of either, well, that's not what I said, or it gives you some other form of plausible deniability. So because of this, for misinformation, the statistic or information being accurate is irrelevant to whether it's misleading. Things like how it's presented, what information is excluded, the tone, the context, they all play a far bigger part in the story it's trying to tell. So another example here is if I were a lockdown fanatic and wanted the UK to lock down incessantly, and I tweeted the ambulance stat or that London ICUs were at capacity, I'd reasonably expect people to question the accuracy, but beyond that, I would expect them to ask me what I was attempting to convey and also how that statistic bolsters my claims. And to those questions, I wouldn't expect them to just accept me saying, those figures are accurate, don't shoot the messenger. It just isn't a serious answer. Unfortunately, this is basically the stance that Paul appears to have taken in both this article and on his Twitter feed this morning. He's standing by the figure, which is absolutely fine, but he's now had 24 hours or so to explain the context that could potentially exonerate him from accusations of misinformation, and he's yet to do this, despite just having written an article that gave him exactly that opportunity. Instead, as I stated at the start, to me, it's just avoided the substance of the issues to focus on things that aren't really related to the statistic at all and are actually related to the nature of Twitter, and I think that's a real shame. So to sum up, the article itself, ironically, appears to be just a larger manifestation of the original tweet's misleading nature, and that nicely brings us full circle. As far as I can see, every point he's made in the article is accurate, but the story he's telling is not a full picture of what happened yesterday. Despite his assertions, the majority of comments he received were polite, and they simply explained to him that the stat was misleading and therefore potentially dangerous. And this is because it could reasonably lead people to believe that COVID is less of a threat than it is, and that could in turn lead to hospital capacity being overrun and many unnecessary deaths. So as I've explained, just because a statistic is accurate, it doesn't make it neutral, and it doesn't make the story you're attempting to tell with it accurate. Therefore, no appeals to accuracy can mitigate the misleading use of a statistic to promote political aims. Indeed, as Paul neatly sums up for us at the end of his article, facts are facts, and that doesn't change just because some people find them inconvenient.